I turned it off. Okay. Five, four, three, two, one. Good afternoon and welcome to this month's edition of the Month in Review, the first Sunday of every month where we take the opportunity to review the big sort of stories, the big trends that have impacted the oil markets in the month in the rearview mirror and maybe what's coming in the month ahead. We meet here on Sunday, the 2nd of November, with Brent crude oil trading at $64.77. And when we had the opportunity a month ago to sit down with Christophe Roule, oil prices, Brent, were pretty much the same. But they've made a big journey in the interim, and that's perhaps the interesting point of discussion. In the month that passed, Brent, which has been sitting pretty at $65 a barrel for most of the last 3 or 4 months on average, took a visit to $60 and maybe even peaked over the edge into the 59 and change for an intraday moment. Basically around the weeks in the month of October, when the US and China brought their full-scale trade war back into the public consciousness, and in that few weeks that it seemed they were going to punch each other, the prices dropped $5. And when the world figured out that they weren't going to punch each other, at least not too dramatically, prices recovered back to the comfortable spot of in the $65 number. So that's kind of the month in review in cap. Christophe Roule, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and the anchor of our first Sunday of the month review. What's your big takeaways from this the month past, Christophe?
Good evening. So I think compared to previous months as we had, so this was a very quiet one and a very predictable one. Very few surprises except one big one. And that's something where I would put the emphasis slightly different from what you just said. I think we saw the oil price coming down on one of the best advertised, supply overhangs of all times, finally falling towards falling below 60. And before it happened, it was mostly the announcement of sanctions on Russia, I think, which brought it back up. In all other respects, from the erratic take against China to the prepared sort of SAMEC and the triumphant explanation that this was a 12 out of 10, and the rather thin, truce which really emerged in this meeting with Xi, I think it was not very surprising. And we are sort of well on course of an actually pretty quiet period where one has to wait for what's next in Trump's surprise box, I think. That's my key takeaway. Everything is fairly predicted. The next days on the horizon, the big one is going to be, I think it's November, either 12 or 21, I always mess them up, when the deadline for the sanctions on Russia expires, whether we will see a new variation of the TACO trade or not. That's the next big date. Everything else from Venezuela to the economic situation around and the Fed cuts is something which is sort of slowly developing, and we have to wait for the surprises the big maestro will create.
Well, let's go to Hong Kong with our guest this month, Bill Zhao, former managing director at CPP Investments. I would sort of challenge Christophe's general analysis there that nothing much happened, so to speak. I took a very profound view that this month we saw China emerge on the global stage very much as an equal to the US. At least that was my big takeaway. The rare earths sort of knife was thrown on the table early in the month. Prices dropped $5. Trump came to the summit, and coming out of it, China and the US, basically Washington is back where it started 6 months ago. And except it's put America through a lot of stress. A lot of farmers having heart attacks, and nothing much has changed for them, except their misfortune has got a lot worse. Your thoughts on the sort of dynamics between China and the US that came to the fore this last month, particularly through the sort of face-off around the rare earths and then the meeting in South Korea?
Well, thanks, Jan. I think you're absolutely right because this recent Trump-Xi meeting summit in South Korea actually is quite a big thing, at least in Asia. But a lot of people actually think about like China actually win, sort of like a wins. Xi wins this round of like the trade war from
Well,
like
we asked the
some,
survey question on our
right.
podcast the last week, and by overwhelming majority, people are perceiving this 6 months to be a China win, a Xi win.
Yeah, so I'm probably gonna interpret that a little bit differently. So I think if you compare what we are today and what we were 6 months ago, if you compare the tariff rate, if you compare a lot of other non-tariff measures, you probably think like today and probably 6 months ago are very similar. We're not materially better than 6 months ago in terms of the tension on the trade war. But there's one thing I think you're absolutely right, is like China's response now seems to be like much better, especially comparing with like the first round, like the Trump 1.0 days. So I think there's one very important point in this is like Beijing is actually very good at learning from past lessons. And they are very serious in preparing for the measures and the countermeasures, study the situation, and then try different ways to sort of like mitigate the impacts of tariffs and the non-tariff measures. So let's go back to like the 2018-19. So back then you saw what the China's response was a little bit like a more emotional. Apparently it's like a lack of preparation. So you see like the countermeasures here and there, and it may work, may not work. And domestically, you see a lot of different voices, like what is the best approach, and what were the true intention of U.S. of Washington, whether it's like contention or contentment, or it's like just like a tactical, and Trump wants something from China, right? So, but this time around, you see not just the government. If you ask the corporate, if you ask the private enterprise owners, they came out as like a very different response this time. So I think a sort of like internal consensus is no matter what Beijing is going to respond to the trade war, there are some structural issues that may not be solved anytime soon. So given that's the base assumption even for many corporates, so now the best way is actually just preparing for the really bad days.
Christoph, looking again in the rearview mirror of the month past, and of course, most notably in terms of the monetary side, the Fed meeting, I come into the end of the month. I'm still confused whether are we in a good economic window or a bad economic macro window? Is the U.S. doing well or is it not doing well? The Fed chair sort of warned the market not to assume that there would be another rate cut next month. Your thoughts on what you take away from the macro picture after October?
So if by we, you mean the whole world?
Yes,
Well,
yes, yes. I
then
mean the two big economies, U.S. and China. But U.S. most notably because it has been the one that has supposedly been pulling the train.
The point is you don't mean Dubai, right?
Dubai is its own universe.
Yeah. So I think what we are seeing is that clearly the early sort of catastrophic pictures and warnings of the consequences, especially the inflationary consequences of the tariffs, have not materialized yet. We're also seeing as everybody seems to agree on, surprisingly resilient economy in the US and in the other OECD states, I should say. And we see China sort of struggling to keep the ship at about 5% growth, which they have accomplished so far. I think we are in a situation where the economy in the US is weakening, and it's a bit obscured now with the government shutdown and the lack of data, but it becomes visible on the ends, and it's weakening in a double sense, in the general sense of economic growth, which is concentrated very much now in the AI sector, and that's reflected in stock markets, and where the problems become visible in the labor and the housing markets. But it's also creaking in a secondary way, which is that these income differentials, which have been built over such a long time, are now coming home to roost. And we are seeing really, as a consequence also of the shutdown, the suffering of large, of, let's say, 40 million people, 42 million people on food stamps, which may not be delivered. And that kind of thing is boding bad in the medium and the long term, not only for the economy, but also for the political consequences of a bad economy. Now, on the Chinese side, we have seen a continuation of all these fires which need to be extinguished, a confirmation of what we have discussed here many times, that the government is still organized enough and has enough central firing power to extinguish these little bushfires that overwhelm zombie banks, regional debts, and banking frauds, and so on, one by one, and to keep the economy at a keel of 5%. But slowly, they're running out of options. And again, one more time, it has to do with the over-centralization of this economy. They threw their resources now on another bet in the industrial sector, this time new technologies, EVs in particular, technologies which are associated in Europe also with the energy transition, electrification of everything. And when the export markets for that sort of are getting tighter, then the economy will struggle. Having said all this, we should never sort of forget, that somebody like Larry Summers had described that when it comes to the question of relative economic performance. And he always said, China is a jail, Japan is an old people's home, Europe is a museum, and it really is the US with a large gap, which drives the global economy. And I think that is still true, and despite all the attempts of the current administration to eat up the political and economic capital they have accumulated over many decades, will remain true for a while.
Bill, your thoughts on that from the China point of view? Again, it's been sort of mixed views, particularly when you think about China's economic performance from an oil demand point of view and oil import point of view. We saw during the month of October, there was the data point that China's economic growth had dropped below 5 to 4.8%. Yet oil imports had more or less through the year to date maintained a fairly robust number at around 11 million barrels a day of imports. Your thoughts on the health of the Chinese economy and what that may or may not mean for the continuation of significant oil imports?
So I probably separate that question in the short term and the long term. So in the short term, you're absolutely right, and Christopher mentioned. So the Chinese economy seems to be like quite resilient, still hovering around like 5%, up or down like about 50 basis points, adding the arrow of the data. So we pretty much see like the numbers are around in that range, and for that. My own interpretation is like one thing for sure is like you see the worst timing for the Chinese economy probably is behind us. So that's for sure.
But why do you say the worst?
Yeah, because the worst scenario, think about like 2 or 3 years ago, where China was like suffer from COVID, like the most of the country actually had to shut down, right? So, and the communications, like in-person trade investment between China and the rest of the world actually are negatively affected in a huge way. And also like back then there was discussion whether China will actually adopt a more Stalin type of Soviet Union economy and nationalize all the private companies, right? So that was actually triggered sort of like the stock market response for all the private companies listed. So, but if you look at, and also like you see like financial reports of the companies, we can see like the listed ones. But if you combine all of them compared today versus like 2 or 3 years ago, and you can see like even at the macro level and the firm level data listed companies, you have seen them, the earnings and the profitability and like the leverage and all the financial indicators seems to indicate that they many of them actually probably get out of the woods already. Not in a V-shape, not the V-shaped rebound, but it definitely is not actually
what about oil
stuck in the mud.
imports then? I mean, if the worst is over in the Chinese macro economy, yet oil imports have sustained at a fairly decent level, do you expect oil imports to continue? And what does that mean for oil inventories in China?
I think that's a $1 trillion question. So
Yeah.
I cannot claim I have
Literally.
an answer for that.
But the point is, do you consider it to be accurate reporting that China has added about 500,000 barrels a day to oil inventories this year?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone actually has the accurate official numbers of the storage, because that China does not actually publicly publish that data. So all the data we have today probably is collected from like the proxies, the second-hand, the third party, and tracking every shipment, right? So all the approaches per se probably had some errors, and we should not forget. But another thing I think for the trend wise, there's two things I think probably is difficult to measure, but I think should consider as well. So one is the electrification of China. So one big users of the oil is actually the transportation, but China actually very heavily adopt the EV. So now if you go to like the big cities and even smaller cities, probably half of the new cars you see is actually all the EVs, electronic, one way or another. And even now you see a lot of like the trucks actually are, and more trucks actually are being reported actually using electricity or hydrogen. So actually being used in industry. So that's the trend. Another one that actually is very interesting is actually you mentioned earlier is on the sanction, the potential sanction risk, the secondary sanction risk. So for that, without like the long-term certainty or visibility of the sanction, a lot of Chinese companies that probably have the incentive actually to front load the import of crude oil and as much as they can. So that's probably like the short-term thing.
So that's likely to continue then, from the point of view of the uncertainty of the secondary sanctions. It would seem a little bit odd that after this so-called ceasefire, if you like, between Xi and Trump last week, that they would turn around and hit the Chinese with secondary sanctions, even if it's kind of part of the agreement, or if it's a separate thing. It would seem like an odd choice. Christoph, just looking forward as to where we go from here now. I mean, we're deep into towards the end of the year, a few weeks left before the holiday season kicks in. There's another there's an OPEC meeting, expectations today that they're going to continue with their supply increase. You mentioned in your earlier comment there that this sort of supply glut, the surplus of supply, is going to continue to weigh down on prices. What are your thoughts on that going forward as we go deeper into the end of the year?
I think there is a very interesting conundrum developing. As you know, in many of your previous sessions, I was always the super bearish, always saying, it's going to be weighted down, it's going to be a supply glut, it's in the numbers. Now everybody agrees to that, but it hasn't really materialized on a big scale, and there's a huge number of barrels which are supposed to be somewhere but have disappeared. And I think we all agree that to a larger extent, to some extent, of course, they've never been produced because OPEC Plus members couldn't expand their production as much as announced. But to a larger extent, they have disappeared in Chinese storage, and storage which has expanded relentlessly. If I understand Bill right, then the capacity for China to build out storage capacity and the willingness of China to increase the actual inventories when there's a chance at cheap prices are still present and still continuing. So that source of absorption for global oil flows is not gone, but still exists. Now, if I understand you right, and I would agree with you, is that after this meeting between Xi and Trump, if anything, Xi will not, suddenly stop buying Russian oil. He will certainly continue that. And so we have a situation in which the ability and the willingness of China to add to storage continues to absorb part of this or all of this global surplus. And at the same time, where the sanctions which Trump has imposed to Russia will be relatively inconsequential because they will just continue, maybe even to a bigger extent than before, to be soaked up by China, disappear in China. So we have to ask, what's the consequence of these two factors? The increased inventory built in China, as long as the price is right, that is something which will stabilize prices in a way. The increased export on a gray market of Russian barrels, in principle, should drive prices down a little bit, but not if it all disappears in China. So I think we are still seeing in the big picture of things on supply overhang, not as big as people thought. And more than ever before, the actual consequences of that will depend on political decisions. And it looks as if, as long as the price is right, China will continue to do what it's doing. And even more interestingly, it looks as if all along OPEC Plus, in its continuous attempts to increase and scale back its production cuts, knew something the market didn't, which is it knew about the potential of China and the willingness of China to just stoke up inventories to such a large extent. They were not desperate to get their production cuts back. This was measured and calculated. They were not betting on a sudden increase of demand, which seemed to be increasingly unrealistic, and their own forecasts seemed to be increasingly unrealistic. They were done none of that. They knew that if they would proceed step by step, where the oil would be going, and that they had a chance to put themselves in a position of full capacity utilization at the point in time when some of that surplus will really sort of weigh on markets, and when the ability to sell at a lower price matters in the competition of oil producers.
I wanted to get your view, Bill. The other big event, obviously, in the last month and very relevant moving forward, is the China's just announced its 15th five-year plan, which they released after their meeting last week, with the outlook that they've sort of sketched a plan 2026 to 2030, which sort of signals not a continuation of business as usual. How have you interpreted the release of the China plan for the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think if there's one thing you should really take very seriously about this statement, I think at the same time most of the Western media seem to miss that point, is like one sentence actually get back to the statement of the 15th five-year plan versus like the 14th five-year plan, which is part of like sentence from the party constitution that the direct translation would be economic development is the core mandate. So the 5 years ago, this sentence actually was removed from the formal text after the plenum, but this time actually they added it back. So I think this is actually the
Say the sentence again that they added.
Sorry, forgive my translation. I think this one is like focusing on economic development as the core mandate.
Economic development as the core mandate of the Chinese government. Okay.
The Chinese, yeah. So, or economic construction, if that's using the more direct translation. But anyways, this is the word actually is the sort of like the slogan for China to put a pro-growth as the core of the government and the party's mandate. So I think this is, you cannot be more serious about this adding back of that sentence. So what's the implication of that? So like one direct implication is like in the next 5 years, the government is going to be very serious about maintaining or keeping economic growth at a certain level. So the 2035 plan to make China entering the middle advanced country, so that mandate is still valid, which means a certain level of nominal economic growth should be maintained for China. That's mandated. So, and although like China probably going to rely and develop innovate on energy side, new energy, but the traditional energy source, especially the ones China does not have a big reserve or cannot manufacture much, like crude oil and gas. So there's still going to be something China is going to keep importing from the rest of the world. And another reason for that is like just follow up on something Christoph touched upon on. It's like another thing is actually the national security concerns. So unlike Russia, so China does not have a lot of extra capacity of oil reserves. So China is actually just not importing energy. So for national security,
Coal as well, and gas and
coal.
oil and all of it.
And food.
China has a lot of coal, but then
I know it is a lot,
environmental
but it
reasons,
still imports.
still imports. That's right. But for crude, of course, like I think like China needs to keep like importing, because unless there's some like breakthroughs in technology, like China can suddenly become like all depends on solar or wind. Until that inflection point, I think that the sustainable demand from China will be there.
Christoph, I wanted to get your thoughts on another big event, I think big in some regards, that happened in October that plays to where is it going to go next? And that is, we saw in October both Bitcoin and gold reach record levels and then retreat back quite noticeably so by the end of the month, and Bitcoin having its first negative month for a while. What do you take away looking forward for gold and Bitcoin? Always seems like a risk on kind of measure. Gold is a risk off, and yet they both corrected towards the end of October.
Well, I think, this is what you have when you have very volatile markets, and you see a lot of speculation, of which Bitcoin certainly is. I would think that in a serious market downturn, you would see Bitcoin turning down as well again. And other than that, I don't have anything particular to say or to guess about it. All my adult life, I was wondering why people would hold gold, and now Bitcoin comes along and people hold Bitcoin, and I have to wonder even more. And
the whole Bitcoin and gold, it seems, in that regard, gold is never been more popular.
We are in a rally driven by new things, but very concentrated on the whole AI complex. Bitcoin is a little bit a footnote to that. Gold is something which people always thought they can fall back to in case things go wrong, but which now, and also, but not only because of some central bank purchases, has gained, as you know, enormously in value. And I would expect gold sort of in the longer term to moderate back to be this tool for hedging more, and Bitcoin.
Even though the sort of the scale of inflation seems to be a constant, and gold obviously being a hedge against inflation, and we're in an easing cycle while employment is full employment and inflation is still above target.
Yes, and I think that's part of the reason that these inflationary fears have not gone away for the purchase of gold. But you would expect an adjustment to more normal levels in terms of a downturn, where the speculative element, which is also there, is just falling away from gold. But my advice on gold, I wouldn't take it, John, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm just saying if it tells us anything about the direction of travel. Obviously, gold is one where clearly it over 2 years doubled in value.
It's an age of confusion. Nobody really knows where we're going and what drives the whole thing.
Bill, last word for you on the point made earlier by Christoph. I just wanted to get your clarity on it. The other big event that happened in October was the US coming out very strongly against India in particular, but also China, to reduce or stop buying what they consider sanctioned oil. Do you think China is likely to react, to respond in favor of America's wish to stop buying Russian oil?
I think to a large extent, it probably is not possible because right now, Russia still probably accounts between like 15 to 20% of China's total oil imports. Unless there are some alternative sources like actually can fill that gap before that point, so China probably had to import from Russia. So I think US probably understand that as well. But in terms of short term, it really depends on like the aftermath of this like Trump-Xi meeting. So if the two leaders really get along well and they want to create like a better environment for the next year's, they mentioned the next year's state visit for both leaders. So the
With Xi's going to America in the spring, and Trump is due to go to China sometime after that.
Yeah, exactly. So if that's the case, then I guess probably from now to that point, then all the the Chinese, for now, the Chinese state banks already, it's very difficult for them to actually settle the oil imports involved in dollar payment, right? So I think probably the state-owned oil companies, they will be very careful, but it really depends on the political sentiment. The smaller ones, the private ones, I think this year it really depends on the import quota. So if the ones they haven't filled in the import quota, and they probably need to do a cost-benefit analysis whether at the price at this level, whether it makes sense for them imports. But if they actually reach the quota, like approved this year, then there's nothing more they can do about it. They have to wait until next year.
And I suppose that in itself would be a signal from the Chinese government if indeed they gave more import quotas to the Chinese teapots to import more crude. That would sort of signal that, hey, keep buying that Russian stuff. If they didn't give more quotas, it might be an indirect way to show some positive vibes to Washington. It's all in the tea leaves. Christoph Ruhl, as always, anchoring the Month in Review every first Sunday of the month. Thank you so much. And Bill Zhao, lovely to meet you. Lovely to have you on our air today on the Sunday, first Sunday of November, the Sunday before ADIPEC, which of course kicks off tomorrow, and there'll be lots of noise about all of these subjects through the week. Will any of that have any impact in giving this somewhat sober market at $65 Brent any new direction? We'll have to wait and see. Have a good week, everybody. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.